In 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union won the largest war in human history together. Within just 3 years, they were enemies. Nothing happened in 1945 to make them enemies, they already were. During the time the USA and the Soviet Union spent as allies, they were united by the fight against Hitler. To understand why these two countries couldn't stay allies, you must understand their competing ideologies. The USA was a capitalist state. It believed that individuals should be able to own property and businesses, compete for profit, and decide how to spend their wealth. The USSR, by contrast, was communist. It believed that property and industry should be controlled by the state, with wealth distributed equally across society. We'll now zoom in on the three main differences between the two ideologies, which were political, economic, and social. Politically, the United States was a democracy. Multiple parties competed for power, and voters chose between them in free elections. If you didn't like the government, you could campaign against it, you could publish attacks on it in a free press, and you could vote it out. Power was deliberately divided between the president, Congress, and courts, precisely so that no one person could hold too much of it. The American assumption was that concentrated power is dangerous and that the answer is to split it up and let people check it. This meant it was completely possible for a president to act illegally, and the American legal system could reverse presidential decisions. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was a one-party state. The Communist Party was the only legal party, and Stalin controlled that party. Elections existed, but with a single approved candidate. There was no free press, no legal opposition, and no independent courts. Criticism of the government could end in a prison sentence or labour camp, and during the purges of the 1930s, criticism of the government often ended in execution. The Soviet assumption was the reverse of the American one, that the party alone understood where history was heading, and that opposition wasn't democracy, it was sabotage. Economically, the United States ran a capitalist system. Factories, farms, banks and shops were privately owned by individuals and companies, and they competed. Prices came from supply and demand rather than from government instruction. The promise was opportunity. Work hard, take a risk, and you could become wealthy. The cost was insecurity. There was very little safety net, and the depression of the 1930s had thrown millions out of work with nothing to catch them. The Soviet Union, by contrast, ran a command economy. The state owned essentially everything: industry, land, transport, and resources. Central planners in Moscow decided what would be produced, in what quantity, and at what price. Farming was collectivised, meaning peasants were forced off of their own land into huge state-run farms, a policy that helped cause a famine in which millions died. The promise was security and equality, guaranteed work, guaranteed housing, no private millionaires. The cost was that you had no economic choices at all. The state could demand enormous sacrifice from you. Socially, the difference followed from the other two. In the United States, the individual came first. Personal freedom of speech, of religion, of movement, and of enterprise was the point of the whole system. Americans were taught to see their country as a model the rest of the world should copy. Religion was widespread and protected. In the Soviet Union, the collective came first. The individual's job was to serve the workers' state, and personal ambition at the expense of the group was treated as a moral failure. Religion was actively suppressed, churches closed, and the clergy were persecuted. This was because the party held that religion existed to keep the poor obedient. Culture, education, and art were expected to promote communist values, not to challenge them. Each system claimed to be the future of the human race. Americans believed capitalism and democracy were universally right, and that spreading them was a moral duty. Soviet communists believed capitalism was built on exploitation, that it was designed to collapse, and that helping it collapse faster was their historic mission. This meant each side's beliefs required the other side to fail. This wasn't a disagreement about policy where you could meet in the middle, it was a disagreement about how human beings should live, and there's no halfway house between the individual comes first and the collective comes first. That's the ground the Cold War was built on. Everything else in the narrative of the Cold War is what happens when two countries holding those beliefs are left standing in the same ruined continent. Capitalist states in the West and the USSR also had a turbulent history. First, in 1917, communists seized power in Russia. During the civil war that followed, Britain, France and the United States sent troops to fight the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks won, and Stalin eventually came to power. Stalin never forgot the West had tried to stop his revolution. Second, the United States refused to formally recognise the Soviet Union until 1933, 16 years after it had happened. Third, the USSR wasn't allowed into the League of Nations until 1934. Finally, when Britain and France negotiated with Hitler at Munich in 1938, they didn't invite Stalin at all. So, in 1939, Stalin signed a pact with Hitler and carved up Poland between them. To the West, that confirmed everything. Stalin was untrustworthy. But to Stalin, it was self-defence against people who had already shown they'd rather he'd lost. What united the USA and the USSR in 1941 was Hitler. He invaded the Soviet Union, and suddenly, Stalin and the West had a common enemy. That's the Grand Alliance, and it's worth being precise about what it was. It was an alliance against Hitler, not for anything else. And even inside of it, the suspicion never went away. Stalin begged for a second front in Western Europe in 1942 to take German pressure off the Red Army. He got it in June 1944, 2 years later. Soviet casualties in that period ran into the millions. Stalin drew a conclusion. His allies had been content to watch the Soviet Union bleed. So, was Stalin right? There's a practical answer. An invasion of France against Germany probably would have failed. The landing craft weren't built, the Atlantic wasn't secure, and a failed landing would have set the war back years. But there's also a suspicious answer. Churchill had spent his career opposing communism, and every month the Red Army bled was a month the Soviet Union came out of the war weaker. Both can be true at once, and that's the thing to hold on to. Most of what follows in this series has two opposing interpretations, and the strongest answers are the ones that can argue both. In November 1943, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill met face to face for the first time, and they got on a lot better than anyone expected. That meeting is known as the Tehran Conference, and that's the last time the alliance really worked.